She waited 47 minutes, sat alone at a corner table in a diner that smelled like burnt coffee and broken promises, watching the door like it owed her something. 17 years old, dressed in the blue blouse she'd ironed twice, and absolutely certain the boy she'd been brave enough to say yes to would walk through that door any second now. He never came. 10 years later, Vivian Sterling, billionaire, founder of a media empire worth more than most countries' GDP, walked into a high school reunion she hadn't attended for the food. She came back for the answer. But if this story already has your heart racing, you're exactly where you need to be. Subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story that hits this hard. Drop a like if you're already hooked, and tell me in the comments what city and country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now settle in. This one's going to take a while, and every single minute is worth it. The gymnasium smelled exactly like Caleb Mercer remembered it. Industrial floor wax, old rubber, and something vaguely sweet that he had never been able to identify. Standing near the entrance with a name tag stuck crooked to his lapel, he decided that the smell was the worst part of coming back. Not the decorations, not the class of 2014 banner that someone had hung slightly off-center, not even the DJ playing a playlist that seemed designed to trigger low-grade, existential dread. The smell was the worst part. That, and the very high probability that she was somewhere in this room. He made it approximately 11 minutes before he bailed. Not out the front door. He wasn't that obvious, but down the side hallway past the boys' locker room, around the corner where the old trophy cases lined the wall in a long corridor that connected the gym to the science wing. This part of the school was dark, lit only by the ambient glow leaking in from the gym behind him, and a single flickering fluorescent tube about 30 feet ahead. The trophy cases threw back dim reflections of himself. A 32-year-old man in a sport coat that fit well enough, dark jeans, good shoes, hair that Sophie had declared, "A little messy, Daddy, but the good kind," that morning before he dropped her at his mother's. He stopped in front of a trophy from 2009, State Debate Championship. The little golden figure on top had one arm broken off, leaving a jagged metal stump where the hand used to be. Feels about right, he thought. He'd been in this building maybe 40 minutes total, and already the architecture was doing things to him. That was the professional hazard of being an architectural photographer. He couldn't stop reading buildings, and this one was telling him a story he wasn't sure he wanted to hear. The way the gym ceiling had been patched in 3 different shades of white. The trophy case glass with its long diagonal crack, sealed with tape that had gone yellow and brittle. The floor tiles in the hallway, each one a slightly different shade of beige because they'd been replaced piecemeal over the decades, nothing ever quite matching. Caleb had built his career around spaces like this. Not the grand restorations, the perfectly preserved landmarks, the buildings people flew in from overseas to photograph. He shot the honest ones. The places that had taken damage and kept functioning anyway, patched up and imperfect and still somehow standing. There was a market for that kind of image, smaller than the market for gleaming perfection, but real. He heard heels on tile about 3 seconds before she appeared. The sound was measured, unhurried. Someone who knew exactly where they were going and wasn't in a rush to perform the arrival. Vivian Sterling came around the corner from the gym side, still holding a glass of white wine, and stopped when she saw him. For a full 3 seconds, neither of them said anything. He had seen photographs of her, obviously. You couldn't exist in the world and not see photographs of Vivian Sterling. Her face had been on the cover of 3 different business magazines in the last 18 months alone, and there had been that profile in the Times that his mother had texted him a link to with a string of exclamation points, and then pretended she hadn't. But photographs had apparently been doing her a significant disservice, because in person she was different. Not more beautiful exactly, though she was that. Different in the sense that she occupied space differently than the photographs suggested. Like the images had somehow flattened something that was fundamentally 3-dimensional. She was still looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Hiding?" she asked. "Architectural survey," he said. "The trophy case joinery is actually quite interesting." She looked at the trophy case, then back at him. "The glass is cracked." "I noticed." "The lighting is terrible." "Also noticed." She took one step closer, tilting her head slightly. Her hair was different from high school, shorter now, cut just below her jaw, and she was dressed in something dark and precisely fitted that looked like it cost more than his monthly car payment. But the way she tilted her head when she was assessing something, that was exactly the same. He had forgotten that detail, and now that he was seeing it again, it felt like finding an old photograph tucked inside a book. "I didn't know you'd be here," she said. "My cousin Marcus guilted me into it." He paused. "I didn't know you'd be here either." "I wasn't planning to be." She swirled the wine in her glass, looking at it rather than at him. "Then I was in the area." He nodded like that was a normal thing to say. Vivian Sterling was never simply in the area. The woman ran a media corporation with offices in 7 cities. She did not pass through their small Indiana hometown by accident. But he didn't push it. They stood there for a moment in the dim hallway, the muffled bass from the gym thumping softly through the walls. 2 people who had been 17 together, trying to figure out what they were now. "So," Vivian said, and there was something in her voice that had shifted slightly, a thread of something careful and deliberate beneath the easy surface. "Do you want to tell me why you stood me up?" The question landed like a stone into still water. Caleb stared at her. "I know it was 10 years ago," she continued, and she wasn't cruel about it, wasn't wielding it, just stating it plainly the way she'd always stated things. "I'm not bringing it up to make you feel bad. I always wanted to know. We were supposed to meet at that diner by the Walgreens, the one with the bad pie, and I sat there for 47 minutes, and then I went home. And you just vanished, left town, and I never found out why." Caleb looked at the broken trophy, at the tape on the cracked glass, at anywhere that wasn't her face. "My mom had a brain aneurysm," he said, "the morning of, the day we were supposed to meet. She collapsed in the kitchen while I was getting ready. I rode with her in the ambulance. We didn't know for 3 days if she was going to make it." The hallway was very quiet. "The night we were supposed to meet," he continued, "I was sitting in a hospital waiting room in Indianapolis while a surgeon explained to my dad what the recovery was going to look like. And then everything happened at once. She needed to be closer to a specialist. We had to move, my dad's job, school records. All of it collapsed into about 2 weeks. And He stopped. Started again. "I didn't call you." "No," Vivian said softly. "You didn't." "I thought about it. I thought about it a lot." He finally looked at her. And then enough time passed that there was nothing to say that didn't sound like an excuse. She was quiet for a moment, watching him. "I found out eventually," she said, "about your mom. Junior year, someone mentioned it. You know how small this town is. Once I knew what had happened, I stopped being angry." She paused. "But I always wondered why you didn't trust me enough to say something. Even months later, even a year later, just something." The question sat between them like an open door. Caleb thought about being 17 and gutted and completely convinced in the way that only teenagers could be completely convinced of things. That Vivian Sterling existed in a category of person who did not need to hear about his family falling apart. That she was bright and capable and going places. And his disaster was not something she should have to absorb. That calling her would have been less about honesty and more about burdening her. He had been spectacularly wrong about that. "I thought I was protecting you from something you shouldn't have to deal with," he said. Vivian looked at him for a long time. "That," she said, "is possibly the most aggravating thing you've ever said to me." He almost laughed. "I know. I was 17, not made of tissue paper. I know that now. Caleb, I would have come to the hospital. I would have brought food. I would have sat with you." She shook her head, something flashing through her expression that wasn't quite anger but was adjacent to it. "Instead, I sat in a diner eating bad pie for 47 minutes. 47 exactly? I timed it." She met his eyes. "I was very thorough even then." He looked at her and felt something shift in his chest, not dramatically, not the way it happened in movies, but in the way actual things shifted, slow and uncertain, like tectonic movement you couldn't feel until the ground was already different. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know it's about 15 years too late, but I am." Vivian seemed to consider accepting this, examine it, decide where to put it. "Okay," she said finally. "I believe you." From the gym, faintly, a song started. Something slow, the opening notes of a piano ballad that had been inescapable their senior year, one of those songs that lodged itself in time so thoroughly that hearing it now was basically involuntary memory retrieval. Vivian's expression shifted into something complicated. "Do you know what's deeply unfair?" she said. "A lot of things. That they're playing that song," she said, "when I'm standing in a dark hallway with you specifically." He didn't say anything. She set her wine glass on top of the trophy case, directly on the little placard that said State Champions 2009, without a second thought, and held out her hand. "Dance with me," she said. "We're already hiding from the same party. We might as well." He looked at her hand. He should have said something sensible. He should have pointed out that they were standing on worn linoleum under a flickering fluorescent light, and that one of them ran a billion-dollar company, and the other one had driven to this reunion in a 2019 Subaru with a car seat in the back. He should have said any number of reasonable things. Instead, he took her hand, and they danced, slowly, in the school corridor, with the trophy case and the bad lighting and the cracked glass and the muffled song coming through the walls. And Caleb Mercer discovered that it was entirely possible for something to feel exactly like what you imagined it would, while also being nothing at all like what you expected. She was a few inches shorter than him without the heels adding their contribution. Her hand was smaller than he remembered from the 2 or 3 times they'd bumped into each other in high school, but he hadn't actually held it before, so maybe he'd just invented that detail. "You're a decent dancer," she said, into the space between them rather than directly at him. "Sophie makes me practice in the kitchen." "Sophie?" "My daughter, 7. She pulled back slightly, not stepping away but adjusting the angle, looking at him more directly. "You have a daughter." "I do." "You're married?" "No." He said it simply, without the complicated qualifier he sometimes tacked onto that word. "Her mother left when Sophie was about 8 months old. It's been the 2 of us since then." Something moved through Vivian's expression. He couldn't name it precisely. It wasn't pity. He would have noticed pity immediately, and it would have ended the dance. But it was something attentive and real. "Is she with you, Sophie?" "She's at my mom's for the weekend. She didn't want to go. She's in a phase where leaving home for any reason is a personal affront." He paused. "She packed her stuffed elephant for emotional support." Vivian smiled. It was different from the polished photographs. Smaller, somehow more genuine. "Smart kid. Occasionally terrifying kid," he said. "But yeah." The song shifted, moved toward its final chorus, began its long fade. They slowed. And then Vivian said quietly, "Are you hungry?" He looked at her. "I booked a table," she continued, and there was something in her voice now that was carefully neutral, like she'd practiced the delivery and was hoping the casualness held. "About a block from here, just in case. Just in case. Just in case I found someone worth eating dinner with." She tilted her head slightly. "So far, you're the only viable candidate." The song ended. From the gym, someone whooped. The DJ said something into his microphone that was too muffled to make out. Caleb thought about the gym full of people he'd been actively avoiding. He thought about Marcus, who had guilted him here and would absolutely never let him forget it if he knew what was happening in this hallway. He thought about the drive home he'd been planning, the quiet apartment, the particular silence of a space that was usually filled with a 7-year-old's commentary on everything. "Yeah," he said, "I'm hungry." Vivian retrieved her wine glass from the State Champions placard and finished what was left in it with the air of someone closing a chapter. "Good," she said. She walked back toward the gym to collect her coat, and Caleb followed, and it wasn't until they were pushing through the school's side door into the cool night air that he realized something he probably should have worked out earlier. She had booked the table before she'd even found him. Vivian Sterling had not come to this reunion for the banner or the bad DJ or the fractured nostalgia of a gymnasium that still smelled like floor wax. She had come for exactly one reason, and that reason was currently walking next to her in a sport coat, trying very hard to appear like a man who had not just had his entire evening rerouted by a hand held out in a dim hallway. The night air hit them both, cool and carrying the smell of October leaves and distant rain. Vivian glanced at him sideways. "Try not to be 47 minutes late this time," she said. He didn't answer, But for the first time in a longer while than he cared to admit, Caleb Mercer was smiling as he walked. The restaurant was called Henley's, and it was the kind of place that understood its own purpose without making a fuss about it. Low lighting, booths with real wood backs worn smooth from decades of use, a menu printed on a single laminated card that hadn't been redesigned since approximately 1997. It was not the kind of restaurant that Vivian Sterling was typically photographed leaving. It was also, Caleb noticed when they pushed through the door and were immediately hit with the smell of garlic butter and something braised, exactly right. The hostess recognized Vivian immediately. He could see it happen. The slight widening of the eyes, the half-second recalibration, the professional smoothing over that followed. But Vivian gave her a small, genuine smile and said, "I have a reservation under Sterling." And that was the entire transaction. No performance, no acknowledgement that being recognized was anything other than logistically useful. They were seated in a corner booth near the back window, which looked out onto a wet street where yellow light pooled beneath the lampposts. Caleb slid in across from her and picked up the laminated menu and read it with the focused attention of someone who genuinely wasn't sure what he wanted and wasn't pretending otherwise. "The pork chop," Vivian said, without looking at her own menu. "You've been here before?" "I looked it up this afternoon." She set the menu aside. "I always look up the menu in advance." "Of course you do. It saves time. Or it means you can't be surprised." She considered that. Both things can be true. The waiter came, young, probably a college student, making a visible effort not to stare at Vivian while absolutely staring at Vivian. And they ordered. Pork chop for her, which turned out to be the right call since Caleb ordered it too after a moment of deliberation that he immediately abandoned. A bottle of something red that Vivian chose by pointing at the menu without ceremony, not to perform humility but because she apparently did not care what the wine cost when the dinner mattered more. And the dinner mattered. That much was immediately clear. It started in the way that dinners after long gaps tend to start, with the surface layer, the easy stuff. "What did you do? Where did you go? How did you end up here?" Vivian gave him the condensed version of the last decade, which even condensed was a lot. Graduated early from Northwestern, got hired by a media startup in Chicago at 22, worked herself into a leadership position by 24, bought out the founder at 26 with backing she'd spent 2 years securing, built it into something that made financial journalists use words like disruptive and anomalous, and occasionally alarming. She said this last part with a small, dry smile, like alarming was a compliment she had specifically earned. "What's the company called?" Caleb asked. "Meridian Group." He nodded slowly. He knew the name. His mother had mentioned it approximately 4 months ago in the context of a documentary series Meridian had produced about urban architecture. She had mentioned it in a way that was extremely casual and not at all a pointed observation about anything. He had not responded to the pointed observation. "I've heard of it," he said. "Most people have by now." She said it flatly, not modestly, not proudly, just as information. "That's sort of the point. How many people work for you?" "Directly, about 300, adjacent companies, contractors, licensing partners." She moved her hand slightly, a gesture that indicated the number became sufficiently large to be impractical to state. "More." Caleb turned his water glass in a small circle on the table. "And is it what you wanted? When you imagined it at 17, is that what it looks like?" Vivian looked at him with an expression that suggested this was not a question she was asked very often. "Parts of it," she said slowly. "The work is. The company genuinely is. I built something that functions and matters and didn't exist before I made it exist, and that's..." She paused, finding the honest version rather than the press release version. "That's real. That part is everything I wanted." Another pause. "The rest of it is different from what I imagined." "What's the rest of it?" She looked out the window at the wet street. "Every person in a room with me is calculating something," she said. "Not maliciously, mostly. It's just, if you have what I have, you become a resource to people before you become a person. Investors, partners, acquaintances, the people my board keeps trying to introduce me to at dinners I don't want to attend." She turned back to him. "You learn to read it very quickly. The interest that's actually about you and the interest that's about what you can provide." "That sounds exhausting." "It is. She said it simply, without self-pity. I'm very good at it now, but it costs something. Every time it costs something. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Outside, a car passed through a puddle and threw water up against the curb. So why are you here? He asked. Not the restaurant. I mean, here, tonight, the reunion. You could have looked me up through 7 different channels without setting foot in that gymnasium. Vivian wrapped both hands around her water glass. I was in Indianapolis 2 weeks ago for a meeting, she said. I drove past the old diner on my way to the airport. The one by the Walgreens. She stopped. It's a cell phone repair place now. Yeah, I know. Has been for a few years. I sat in my car outside it for about 15 minutes. She didn't sound embarrassed by this, just precise about the facts. Thinking about the last time I was in that parking lot, which led to thinking about you, which led to thinking that I had spent a genuinely embarrassing amount of my adult life occasionally wondering what would have happened if you'd shown up. She met his eyes, and I decided I was too old to spend another decade wondering. The waiter brought the wine and poured it and left with the trained invisibility of someone good at his job. Caleb picked up his glass and held it without drinking. You said earlier you found out eventually, he said, about my mom. Junior year, Emily Carr mentioned it. She wasn't being kind about it, she was just gossiping, but she had the basic facts right. Vivian turned her glass slightly on the table. I wasn't angry after that. I understood, at least logically, but I still... She pressed her lips together. You were the one person in that school who treated me like a person rather than either a grade curve to compete with or a girl to perform for. Do you know how rare that was? He shook his head slightly. That coffee thing, she said. He frowned. What coffee thing? Junior year, November, I think. I was in the newspaper room working on the layout for the issue that was already 2 days late, and someone had spilled something on the main computer and everything was behind and I was not handling it well. She said the last part with the particular understatement of someone who had probably been handling it spectacularly badly. You came in to fix something on the bulletin board, and you didn't ask what was wrong. You didn't try to help. You just went to the machine in the hallway and brought me back a coffee, terrible vending machine coffee, cream, and 2 sugars, and set it on the desk and went back to fixing the bulletin board. Caleb had no memory of this specific event. He had a general memory of bringing Vivian coffee at some point because she drank it constantly, and the machine in the hallway was on his route to the parking lot, but he could not have located the specific occasion she was describing in any filing system his memory maintained. I didn't know you took cream and 2 sugars, he said. You'd apparently noticed at some point. I have no idea when. She looked at him steadily. That's what I mean. You paid attention to the actual person, not the reputation, not the grade, not what I might be useful for. Just me. She paused. And then you disappeared without a word. The food arrived, which was perhaps the right moment for it, because the silence that followed her last sentence had weight and needed somewhere to go. They ate. The pork chop was genuinely good, properly seasoned, not oversauced, the kind of food that knew it didn't need to try too hard. For a few minutes, they let the meal do the work of transition, the conversation finding its way to easier ground. What parts of the building had been renovated since they attended? Whether the debate team's trophy case should legally be considered a cry for help, the DJ's song choices, which Vivian assessed with the detached critical authority of someone who had spent years evaluating media content. He played 3 consecutive songs from 2012, she said. Was that bad? It was a choice, she said, which was clearly not a compliment. Caleb laughed. It surprised him slightly, the ease of it. He had laughed maybe 47 times in the last 6 months, not counting Sophie, who could make him laugh without effort, but in adult company, with another adult, genuinely, and without performing it. This felt like one of those. What? Vivian said. Nothing, just, you're exactly the same. I'm absolutely not the same. The core thing is the same. The way you have an opinion about everything, and it's almost always right, but you state it like it's just a fact rather than an opinion. She tilted her head. Because it is usually a fact. See? He said. Exactly that. She watched him for a moment, and something shifted slightly in her expression. Not softening, exactly, but opening, like a window being moved an inch off the latch. "Tell me about Sophie," she said. And Caleb, who did not typically talk about his daughter to people he'd known for less than 2 hours, found himself talking about Sophie with the slightly helpless fluency of a man who had organized his entire life around one small person and could not, when asked directly, pretend otherwise. He told her about the morning routine, which required negotiation on par with international diplomacy. He told her about the elephant, whose name was Gerald, who had survived 3 washing machine cycles and was structurally compromised but emotionally essential. He told her about Sophie's teacher calling him in October because Sophie had submitted a book report on a novel she hadn't read, had instead written a completely original story about the book she wished the title had been about, and had argued, when caught, that hers was objectively a better story and she should receive extra credit. The teacher had been simultaneously frustrated and impressed. Caleb had held it together through the conference and then laughed for approximately 4 minutes alone in the parking lot. "She sounds extraordinary," Vivian said. "She's a lot," he said. "She's a whole lot. Some days she's—" He moved his fork slightly, searching for the word. "Some days it's just the two of us at the kitchen table and she's telling me something about her day and I think, however I ended up here, I did something right." "And her mother?" Caleb set his fork down. Not with drama, just with the slight change in posture of someone entering a topic they'd navigated enough times to have a reliable route through. "Rachel, we weren't together long. We were together in that way you are at 22 when you're not being especially thoughtful about it. She got pregnant, we tried to do the right thing, and about 2 years in she told me she wasn't built for it, for either of us." He paused. "She signed over full custody. She sends Sophie a card on her birthday. Sophie accepts this with more grace than I do, honestly." "How do you mean?" "I mean, she doesn't seem angry about it. She just processes it the way kids process the things that are just the shape of their life. Like, this is how my family is, so this is normal." He looked at the table. "But I watch for it. I watch for the places where it's going to hit her later, and I try to—" He stopped. "I try to make sure she has everything around her she needs so that when it does hit her, she's not standing there alone." Vivian was quiet for a moment. "You've been doing that alone for 6 years, she said. 7. Almost. "Caleb, it's fine. I'm good at it now." "I didn't say you weren't good at it." Her voice was careful, precise. "I said you've been doing it alone." He looked at her. There was nothing in her expression that resembled pity. What was there was more uncomfortable than pity. It was recognition. The look of someone who understood the specific texture of building a life in which you were the only structure available. "The last person I was with," Vivian said, after a moment, "was a man named Douglas, who worked in venture capital and was genuinely charming in the way that people who need things from you are often genuinely charming." She said his name with the neutral delivery of someone who has fully processed a situation. "We were together for 8 months. He was good at the early part, attentive, interesting, remembered details. And then his firm hit a rough patch, and he very casually mentioned one evening over dinner that he thought a media company with my kind of reach could be valuable to certain of his clients if I was open to a conversation. He said that. He said it like it was a natural thing to say, like we had built to that point together and this was just the next logical step." She picked up her wine glass. "I went home that night and realized I couldn't actually remember the last time he had asked me something about myself that didn't connect, eventually, to something he wanted." "What did you do?" "I ended it. Matter of fact, no performance. I'm very efficient about things that aren't working. And before him?" She shook her head slightly. "Before him there was a pattern, which is that I am very good at assessing situations clearly and very bad at the part where you let someone close enough to matter before you've finished assessing them. Because by the time I decide someone might be trustworthy, I've usually built walls that take more effort to dismantle than feels proportionate." "That sounds lonely." She looked at him, direct, unguarded, in the particular way that comes from making a deliberate choice to be unguarded rather than from not having the option. "Yes," she said, "it is." They sat with that for a moment. The restaurant had filled around them without either of them noticing. the ambient noise of other people's conversations creating a kind of privacy by surrounding them with noise they didn't need to attend to. "I looked up your work," Vivian said. "Your photography." He was quiet. "About 2 years ago, actually. I was looking at a feature someone had shared about architectural photographers working in the Midwest, and your name was in it. And I—" A slight pause. "I went looking. I found your portfolio website." He could picture the portfolio website. It was functional and not beautiful, and he'd been meaning to have someone redesign it for approximately 3 years. "And," he said, "it's stunning." She said it without qualifier or performance. "The way you shoot decayed spaces, the Packard Building series, the Calumet steel mill images. There's something in the way you frame things that makes the damage look," she thought, "not beautiful exactly, more like honest. Like the building is telling you something it hasn't told anyone else." Caleb looked at his plate. He had been told his work was good by people who knew photography and by people who didn't. He had been told it was important and interesting and technically accomplished, but he could not remember the last time someone had described it back to him in a way that identified precisely what he was attempting to do, the specific intention behind the framing choices, the thing he was actually reaching for. "That's what I'm trying for," he said quietly. "Every time. That's the thing." "I know," Vivian said. "It came through." Outside, the rain had started again, light and steady, beating on the window glass. Caleb watched it for a moment. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You're going to anyway." "At the reunion. You said you came because you were in the area, but you'd looked up my work 2 years ago. You'd driven past the diner and sat in the parking lot." He turned from the window to look at her. "How long have you been thinking about this?" Vivian held his gaze. "Longer than is probably reasonable," she said finally. "How long?" A pause. The honest version then. "I never fully stopped," she said. "That's the accurate answer. There were years where it was very background, where I was busy enough that it didn't matter, but it was always there." She set down her wine glass. "You were the one that got away, except that implies you were ever mine to lose, which wasn't exactly the situation. What you were was the thing I never found out about. And there's a specific kind of person who cannot tolerate an incomplete story." "Let me guess," Caleb said. "That kind of person founded a media empire." "Turns out unresolved narratives bother me professionally and personally." The check came eventually. Vivian reached for it with the automatic reflex of someone for whom paying is easier than negotiating who pays, and Caleb put his hand briefly on the check holder in a way that was not a grab but was a clear statement of intent. They looked at each other. "Split," she said. "Fine." They paid. They stood and put on coats. And the waiter, the college student who had spent the evening working very hard not to acknowledge that one of his tables was a woman whose company had probably produced content he watched, said, "Have a good night," with the genuine warmth of someone who had enjoyed watching the two of them without being able to name why. They stepped outside into the rain, which was light enough to stand in without an umbrella becoming urgent, and walked without discussion in the same direction, down the block and around the corner onto a street Caleb had not visited since the last time he was in this town, which was almost 18 months ago for his cousin's engagement party. He recognized where they were heading before she said anything. The diner had been a cell phone repair place for 3 years. The awning was still there. The same narrow green awning, just faded now. The lettering of the old diner's name gone, but the striping still visible if you knew what you were looking for. Someone had stuck a promotional decal in the corner of the window that had partially peeled away, which made the glass look like it was in the process of forgetting something. They stopped underneath the awning. The rain tapped on it softly above them. Vivian looked at the window for a long moment. At the ghost of the signage, the shape of a place that was still there in the structure but had become something else in the function. "I want to tell you something," she said, "and I'm going to say it plainly because I don't have the patience for anything else at this point in my life." Caleb turned toward her. "I came back here for you," she said. "Not for the reunion, not for nostalgia. For you, specifically. And I don't know what that means logistically. I live in New York, you live in Chicago. There's about a decade of gaps in what we know about each other. I'm not pretending any of that doesn't exist. She looked at him steadily. But I didn't want to spend another 10 years wondering. I'd rather know. Caleb looked at her face, rain damp and lit by the streetlight from across the street, and thought about 17 in waiting rooms and trains, pulling out of stations, and all the ways he had learned to leave things before they left him. He was 32 years old. He had a daughter who packed an elephant for emotional support. He had spent the better part of a decade being the only load-bearing wall in a structure he'd built around protecting the two of them from anything that might collapse. And standing under a faded awning in front of a cell phone repair shop that used to be a diner, he reached forward and put his hand along Vivian Sterling's jaw and kissed her. She kissed him back. It was not elegant. His nose bumped hers at the start, and she made a small surprise sound, and then both of them adjusted, and it became something better than elegant. It became real, the specific realness of two people who had waited long enough to stop performing anything. When they pulled apart, the rain was still going. Vivian looked at him with the expression of someone cataloging new information. "Okay," she said, slightly breathless. "Okay," he agreed. She pressed her lips together, something that was almost a smile, trying not to be. "I'm in Chicago next weekend," she said. "I have meetings there. I was going to fly back to New York Friday evening, but I can move the flight." He looked at her. "You want to come to Chicago?" "I'm coming to Chicago. The question is whether you want to show me your city." She glanced at him sideways. "I've never been, photographically speaking." "It's a great city, photographically speaking." "So I've heard." She paused. "I'll be there Saturday morning, if you want." If he wanted. Caleb Mercer, standing under a faded green awning in light rain, thought about that phrase and all the ways he had trained himself not to want things that might not stay. "Yeah," he said. "I want." Vivian nodded once, like this was a decision logged and confirmed. She didn't say anything else dramatic about it. She didn't need to. She took his hand briefly as they turned back toward the main street, a quick, natural clasp like they'd been doing it for years. And then she let it go when they reached the intersection where their directions separated. Her hotel was to the left. His rental car was in the opposite direction. "Saturday," she said. "Saturday," he confirmed. She walked left. He turned right. He made it half a block before he stopped and looked back, mostly without meaning to. She was already facing away, moving toward the hotel with that particular stride of someone who had somewhere to be. She didn't look back, but she hadn't said goodbye. Neither had he. Caleb put his hands in his coat pockets and walked to his car in the rain. And the thing he couldn't quite locate yet, the shape of what this was, the size of it, what it would cost and what it might become, moved somewhere beneath his sternum with the slow, uncertain weight of a thing that was genuinely starting. He didn't know what to do with it yet, but he didn't look away from it either. That was new. The 6 days between Indiana and Chicago passed in a way Caleb had not experienced in years, not slowly, not quickly, but with a kind of texture that made each hour feel distinct. He noticed this the way you notice a change in weather before you can name what's different. The air has shifted, the light is at a different angle, something that was flat has acquired dimension. Vivian texted him at irregular intervals, which was itself a thing he hadn't expected. He'd half anticipated that once they were back in their separate cities and respective lives, the momentum of the reunion and the awning and the rain would dissipate into something more manageable. A pleasant memory, a contact saved in his phone. One of those almost things that adult life was quietly full of. Instead, she sent him a photograph at 6:40 Tuesday morning of a sunrise over the Hudson that she'd apparently caught from her office window, with no caption. An hour later, she sent a second message. "Meetings start in 12 minutes. I've had 4 coffees." Current status, functional but not pleasant. He sent back, "Sophie refused to wear shoes this morning. Held the kitchen hostage for 20 minutes. Current status, late but victorious." Her response was a single question mark followed by, "She won?" "She always wins," he typed. "I know this. I still negotiate every time." The conversation continued that afternoon when he was between appointments, and then in the evening when Sophie was in bed and the apartment had settled into the particular quiet that only existed after she was asleep. A quiet that contained the echoes of the day, crayon smell, and cartoon sound effects, and the specific cacophony of a 7-year-old living at full volume. He sat at the kitchen table with his laptop and a mug of coffee gone lukewarm and talked to Vivian about architecture. She'd asked him to explain the Calumet series, the photographs of the old steel mill she'd mentioned at dinner, and he found himself going into it further than he usually did, further than felt comfortable, actually, the part where the work became personal rather than technical. He told her about driving out there for the first time at 25, Sophie not yet born, still in the phase of taking whatever assignment came and building a portfolio from scraps. He'd expected a standard industrial ruin, and instead had stood inside the collapsed main hall and felt something that he still didn't have a precise word for. Not sadness, not beauty, something that lived between them. Something about scale and time and the arrogance of assuming a thing built to last would last. "Why did you go back?" she asked. "The series has 9 photographs. You went back 8 more times." He thought about this. "Because I hadn't gotten the picture yet," he typed. "There's always one frame that's the real one. The others are you circling it. Sometimes it takes a while to find the angle." A long pause. Then, "I think that might be the most you've ever said about how you think. You're the first person who asked the right question." He sent it and then looked at it and felt briefly exposed, the way you did when something true came out faster than the filter caught it. Her response took 4 minutes. "I'm going to be in Chicago Saturday morning. I land at 9. I'll be at the airport." "You don't have to." "I know," he sent. "I'll be there." He closed the laptop and went to check on Sophie, who had kicked her blanket off and was sleeping with Gerald the elephant wedged under her chin and her mouth slightly open and her expression one of complete armored peace. He stood in the doorway for a moment looking at her, the way he sometimes did. Not anxiously, just with the low-grade, persistent wonder of someone who had built a life around a person he hadn't known to expect. Sophie had gone to her grandmother's Friday afternoon with her overnight bag and Gerald and a list of conditions for the visit that his mother had accepted with the patience of a woman who had raised Caleb and therefore understood the particular genetic line this personality trait traveled down. Saturday morning, he drove to O'Hare with the radio off, which was unusual. He generally needed something to fill space during drives. That morning, he didn't. The city was still quiet in the early way that Chicago in October was quiet. The lake light gray and flat, the streets between the expressway, and the terminals holding that weekend stillness that felt like the city exhaling. Vivian came through the arrivals door pulling a single carry-on. No team, no assistant, no one flanking her, which he'd half expected even though he knew it was unreasonable. She was in dark jeans and a gray wool coat, and her hair was slightly flattened on one side from the flight, and she looked like a person who had gotten up early and traveled and arrived, which was to say she looked entirely real. She saw him and stopped walking for just a half second before resuming. "You actually came," she said when she reached him. "I said I'd be here." "People say things." "I know." He took the carry-on handle without asking. "I said I'd be here." She looked at him for a moment with an expression he was getting better at reading, the one where she was processing new information and deciding where to file it. "Hi," she said. "Hi," he said. They walked to the car. He had thought about what to show her. He'd thought about it more than was probably proportionate, had actually made a list on his phone Wednesday night, which he'd deleted Thursday morning on the grounds that making a list was the kind of thing that revealed too much about how much he cared about this, which was apparently a great deal. He'd ended up with an intuition rather than a plan. That felt more honest. They drove into the city and he took the lakefront route because if you had someone in Chicago for the first time and you did not show them the lake from Lakeshore Drive with the skyline coming up on the left, you were doing it wrong. Vivian sat in the passenger seat looking out at the water with the expression of someone encountering something that was larger than they'd prepared for. "It's enormous," she said. "The lake? It looks like the ocean. People from the coast always say that, and people from Chicago always take it personally." "You don't take it personally?" "I take it as a compliment. It's our ocean. We made it work." She turned from the window and looked at him with that slight tilt, the one that meant she was amused but wasn't going to perform it loudly. He took her to the train station. It was not Union Station, not the postcard one. It was the Harrington Terminal, a smaller 1920s station on the near north side that had been partially restored by a firm Caleb had worked with 3 years ago, a project he'd photographed over 14 months, and which had produced some of the best work of his career. The main hall had a coffered ceiling in cream and pale blue, original brass fixtures that had been painstakingly reconditioned, marble floors cracked in 2 places, but left cracked because the engineers had decided the cracks were structural memory rather than structural failure. The station still functioned, commuter lines ran through it, and there was a coffee stand near the west entrance and wooden benches worn smooth by a century of people passing through, but it was never crowded on Saturday morning, and at 9:30 there was a particular slant of light coming through the high clerestory windows that landed on the marble in a way Caleb had spent an entire afternoon in February trying to capture. He hadn't fully captured it. He never had. They stood in the middle of the main hall. Vivian turned slowly, looking up. She didn't say anything for almost 2 minutes, which was longer than most people allowed themselves. Most people looked, said something appreciative within 30 seconds, and moved on. Vivian looked in the way she did most things, thoroughly, without rush, like she had decided this was worth the full duration of her attention. "The ceiling," she said finally. "Yeah. It's been repaired." She pointed to a section in the northeast corner where the plasterwork was a slightly different shade. There. From a water incursion in 1987, they matched it as close as they could get. But you can see it. If you know what to look for. She lowered her gaze to the floor, to the cracked marble. And they left those. Those are original stress fractures from settlement over the first 30 years. They're stable. And the engineer who consulted on the restoration argued that filling them would be lying about what the building had been through. He paused. "I liked her a lot." Vivian looked at him. "Is this why you brought me here?" "I come here when I need to think," he said. "It's the place I showed Sophie the first time she was old enough to understand what old meant. I told her this building was 100 years old, and she asked if it was going to fall down, and I said no, it had already been through the hard part." He looked up at the coffered ceiling, the repaired section, the morning light moving. She thought about it for a minute, and then said the building must be very tired, but also proud. Vivian was quiet. "She was 4, he added. "She sounds like a lot of work." "She's a lot of everything," he said. "Work, yes. Also, she just says the true thing, constantly, without effort. I don't know where she got it." Vivian glanced at him sideways. "I might have a theory." They got coffee from the stand near the west entrance and sat on one of the wooden benches and talked while the occasional commuter moved through the hall around them, footsteps echoing on the old marble. The conversation moved the way it had at dinner, easily, without the usual friction of 2 people who didn't know each other well enough yet, which struck Caleb as strange since by any objective measure, they didn't know each other well enough yet. They had 1 dinner and 1 kiss in the rain and 6 days of texts. That was not, rationally, a foundation, but it felt like a foundation. He didn't know what to do with that. He took her, after the station, to a neighborhood he'd been shooting for the last year, a stretch of storefronts on the northwest side, mostly family-owned, the kind of urban texture that existed in the gap between gentrification and abandonment, holding its own specific form. He had his camera with him, not because he'd planned to shoot, but because he rarely went anywhere without it. Vivian walked beside him while he worked, and she was good at it. Knew instinctively to hang back when he was framing, didn't narrate what she was seeing, didn't perform enthusiasm. She just moved through the neighborhood with genuine curiosity, stopping at things that interested her, asking the owner of a bakery on the corner about the tile work above the door, information that the woman provided with obvious pleasure and at some length. "How do you know to ask about the tile?" Caleb said when they walked on. "I didn't know. I was curious." She glanced at him. "You can tell a lot about a building from what the owners notice about it, what they're proud of." She seemed happy you asked. "People generally are when you ask about the things they care about." She said it simply, not as insight, just as observation. "It's not complicated." He thought about the coffee and the cream and 2 sugars and didn't say anything. They ended up back at his apartment in the early afternoon, which had required no real decision. They were near it, and it was cold, and there was food there. He'd stocked it that morning with what he had in the refrigerator and a few things from the corner market, which meant the offerings were eclectic but sufficient. He made sandwiches because that was what was available, and also because making sandwiches with someone was less loaded than cooking, which implied more intention than he was ready to perform. Vivian sat on the kitchen counter while he assembled things, which was not what he'd expected. He'd half anticipated she'd sit at the table and maintain the slight formality that had been present at dinner. Instead, she sat on his counter like it was a completely natural thing to do, eating a slice of cheese she'd taken from the cutting board without asking, watching him work. "Sophie drew those, she asked. He looked up. She was looking at the refrigerator, which had a substantial exhibition of Sophie's artwork, held up by an assortment of mismatched magnets. "Yeah, the one on the left is our apartment building." She was very specific about wanting to include the mailboxes. "And the one with the orange, is that Gerald?" "Gerald at the beach. We went to the lake in July, and Gerald had to come because Gerald goes everywhere, and Sophie decided he needed his own sandcastle." Vivian studied the drawing for a moment. Gerald, rendered in orange crayon, was depicted approximately the size of an actual elephant relative to the other figures in the drawing, which meant Cartoon Sophie and Cartoon Daddy were standing beside a sandcastle while a building-sized orange mass dominated the right side of the frame. "She has a sense of scale," Vivian said. "She has a sense of scale," he agreed. They ate at the kitchen table, and the conversation went to her company, which Caleb asked about because he wanted to understand it, and also because he'd noticed she talked about the work, the way he talked about the work, with the specific engaged energy of someone for whom the professional and personal were not cleanly separated, for whom what they built was also partly who they were. Meridian Group had started as a digital media consultancy, which was not the most romantic origin story, but was the honest one. Vivian had identified earlier than most of the industry, that the gap between content generation and content distribution was being misunderstood by everyone in the space, and that the companies trying to bridge it were doing it backwards. She'd built her first tool to address this, licensed it to 3 clients, used the revenue to hire 2 people, and from there it was less a story of meteoric rise and more a story of very specific, very persistent problem-solving applied in sequence over 8 years. "It's not glamorous," she said, "the reality of it. People imagine a boardroom and someone in a good suit saying things that change industries. Most of it is emails. Most of it is finding the right person to fix the thing that broke in a way you didn't anticipate." "But you love it." She considered this. "I love that it's mine. I love that it does what I built it to do and that I understand every part of it. I love it the way you love something you made rather than something you found." He understood this completely and said so. After lunch, she moved to the living room, and he was putting things away in the kitchen when he heard her stop moving, the particular silence of someone who had found something. He came around the corner and saw her standing in front of his drafting table, which was in the corner by the window where the light was best. On the table, and he had forgotten, genuinely forgotten in the planning of the weekend, which in retrospect was either a significant oversight or the universe making a decision without consulting him, was his current sketchbook. He did not only photograph buildings, he had always drawn them, had drawn since high school in a way that was separate from the photography, more personal, less mediated. The sketchbook on the table was the current one, dated entries, varying quality, the visual record of his eye moving through the world. Vivian was looking at a page near the middle. Caleb came to stand behind her and saw which page. He had drawn her twice in this book, once from memory, approximate, working from the accumulated impression of her rather than a specific image, a figure in a coat at a window, face tilted away, something about the line of the shoulders that he'd been trying to get right and hadn't quite. And once 3 days ago, from the photograph she'd sent of the Hudson sunrise, which had included her reflection in the window glass if you looked at the lower corner, and he had looked at it and then drawn what he saw. She turned the page back slowly, found the first one. He waited. "This is me," she said. Not a question. "Yeah. This one..." She looked at the first drawing. "You didn't have a photograph of me when you drew this." "No." "You did this from memory." "I've been drawing buildings from memory for years. The process is the same." He paused. "You look at something long enough, the shape of it stays." Vivian turned another page back, found another sketch, older, from a different context. Not her, just a figure in a crowd at a concert he'd shot last spring, but similar in posture, and he understood from the way she looked at it that she was tracing something. She turned to look at him. "How long have you been doing this?" she said. He didn't answer immediately, because the honest answer required a moment to assemble. "On and off," he said. "Since around junior year." Vivian stared at him. "There are others?" she said. Not a collection. Not on purpose. Just things that came up in various sketchbooks over the years. He stopped, tried again. "You were always the one that got away too. I just processed it differently." She turned back to the sketchbook, looked at the drawing of her reflection in the window glass. "You drew this from my text," she said, 3 days ago. 4. She closed the book carefully, the way you close something that mattered. When she turned around, her expression was doing several things at once, none of which resolved cleanly into something he could name. She looked like someone who had been handed information that changed the geometry of a problem they'd been working on for years. "Caleb," she said, "I know. You never said, in 10 years you never could. I know. I've been reliably useless about this particular subject." He looked at her straight. "I'm aware of the pattern." She breathed out. Not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh. "You're aware of it," she said. "Very aware. And yet here we are," he said, "which I think means something." She looked at him for a long moment in the afternoon light coming through the window, his apartment around them quiet, the drafting table behind her, the sketchbook closed, Sophie's drawings on the refrigerator visible through the kitchen doorway. Then she walked to the couch and sat down, and he sat beside her. And what happened in the hours that followed was less dramatic than a turning point and more like two people finally stopping the work of circling and just sitting still together. They talked. They disagreed about things. She thought a film he mentioned was formally interesting but emotionally dishonest. He thought she was wrong about this. They went back and forth about it with the genuine friction of two people who cared about having the actual argument rather than winning it. She fell asleep for about 40 minutes in the early evening, which she did without ceremony and without apology, just tilted sideways on the couch in the way of someone whose schedule ran at a deficit and whose body had found an opportunity. He worked quietly at the drafting table while she slept. It was, he thought, looking over once at the way she slept, not peacefully exactly, more like efficiently, as if even unconscious she didn't have time to waste. It was genuinely nice. The specific kind of nice that came from another person occupying the same space without it costing you anything. He hadn't had that in a while. She woke up disoriented for about 3 seconds, then oriented and said, "I didn't mean to. You were tired." "I had things I wanted to." "You were tired," he said again, simply, not as a concession, but as a fact. "It's fine." She pushed her hair back and looked at him across the apartment. "You drew while I slept," she said. "Yes." "Did you draw me sleeping?" "No." "That's probably the right call." "Probably." She unfolded herself from the couch and came to look at what he had been working on. The station, the coffered ceiling, a study of the repaired section in the northeast corner, trying again to capture the thing he hadn't yet managed. She stood at his shoulder looking at it for a moment. "You're still trying to get it," she said. "I keep coming back to it." "Why can't you get it?" He thought about this. "Because what I'm trying to draw isn't the ceiling. It's what I feel when I look at it. And those are different problems." Vivian was quiet. "I think," she said carefully, "that might be true about more than the ceiling." He looked at her. She looked back, and there was something in her face that was very still. Not composed, not controlled, but genuinely still. The stillness of someone who had arrived at a moment they'd been moving toward for a long time and were taking it in. Then her phone rang. She glanced at it with the reflexive attention of someone for whom phones going off had trained an automatic response, and her expression shifted in a way that was slight, but that he caught. She declined the call. He watched her. "Everything okay?" he said. "Fine." She set the phone face down. "It's the board. They've been wanting to discuss something this week, and I've been pushing it to Monday." "What kind of something?" She was quiet for a moment, and in that moment he understood that it wasn't a simple something, that this was the thing underneath the weekend, the thing she hadn't said yet. There's a situation with the company, she said. An expansion opportunity. A significant one. She picked up her phone, turned it in her hands. The creative headquarters. We've been planning to build it out, and the original location for it was New York. Made sense logistically, proximity to the board. My office is there. She paused. A few months ago, an opportunity came up to do it in Chicago instead. Space, infrastructure, the talent pipeline from several universities here. It would mean the hub of the operation is here, rather than there. He waited. And separately, she said, the board has been building toward offering me a restructured position. Executive chairwoman, more authority, more strategic scope, less operational day-to-day, which is what I wanted 3 years ago. She set the phone on the table. They've attached it to staying in New York. They want me proximate to the board, which makes sense. Caleb was quiet, working through the shape of what she was describing. So, he said slowly, career of your life in New York or Chicago. Simplified, but yes. And you came here this weekend while this decision is open. Yes. He sat back slightly, looked at her. I'm not going to tell you what to do, he said. I'm not asking you to. But you're telling me about it. Yes. Because you're part of the equation now, she said, and said it the way she said most true things. Directly, without dress on it. You didn't used to be, now you are. And I'm telling you because it feels dishonest not to. Caleb stood up, walked to the window, looked out at the street below where a couple was walking a dog that was very interested in a particular patch of sidewalk. He looked at them for a moment. He thought about what he should say, and what the right answer was, and what a person who was less afraid of loss than he was would say in this moment. Take the New York position, he said. Vivian went very still. It's what you built toward, he said. It's the right move for what you've created. You shouldn't make a logistical decision about a billion-dollar company around a man you've had one date with. He turned from the window. Take New York. He meant it as generosity, as the mature thing, as proof that he wasn't the kind of person who needed her to arrange her life around him. He watched her face process what he'd said. And he saw, with the clarity of someone who had just made a mistake in real time and felt it land, that she had not taken it as generosity. Her expression was not hurt exactly. It was something more specific than hurt. It was the expression of someone who had heard something they recognized. That's very supportive of you, she said. Her voice was entirely level. Vivian, no, I mean it. She picked up her coat from the arm of the couch. That's the mature, reasonable response. She looked at him. It's also exactly what someone says when they've already decided not to fight for something. He opened his mouth. You don't have to fix it right now, she said. I need to take that call. She went to the kitchen to call the board back, and Caleb stood at the window and looked at the couple with the dog, who had finally moved on, and the patch of empty sidewalk they'd left behind. He had said the wrong thing. He had said it for the right reasons, and it had been exactly the wrong thing, and he knew it the same way he knew when a photograph was off. Not because anyone told him, but because the thing he had intended to capture and the thing he had actually gotten were clearly not the same. The sound of her voice, low and professional, came through from the kitchen. He stood at the window and did not move. The board call lasted 22 minutes. Caleb knew this because he stayed at the window the entire time, not deliberately timing it, but aware of the duration the way you were aware of silence in a room, not measuring it exactly, just knowing it was longer than comfortable. The street below had gone quiet in the early evening way of Chicago residential streets, the particular lull between the afternoon foot traffic and the dinner hour. A delivery truck idled at the corner for a while and then moved on. The couple with the dog did not come back. When Vivian came out of the kitchen, she had her coat over her arm and her bag on her shoulder and her phone in her hand, and Caleb understood before she said anything that she was leaving, not dramatically. She wasn't a person who staged exits, but definitively. The way she held the bag told him the decision had been made somewhere during the call, or possibly before it, and that she had used the 22 minutes to arrive at clarity rather than to change her mind. I'm going to get a car, she said. Vivian. It's fine. I have some things to go over tonight before Monday. I said the wrong thing. She stopped near the door. looked at him with an expression that was not unkind and was also not letting him off the hook. "You said a very reasonable thing," she told him. "You were generous and practical, and you gave me the mature response." She tilted her head slightly. "You also said it about 4 seconds after I told you I was factoring you into a major decision, which means you heard that I was putting weight on us, and your immediate instinct was to remove yourself from the equation." He didn't say anything because she was correct. "That's what you do," she said, and her voice was even, not angry, which was somehow worse than anger. "You leave first. You left first when your mother got sick. You disappeared before I could decide how to respond to it. You told Sophie's mother the marriage wasn't working before she finished telling you she was unhappy, I'd guess. You told me to take New York before I asked you what you wanted." She looked at him steadily. "You are very good at preemptive departure." "That's not what I was doing." "Caleb." She said his name with the patience of someone who had run out of patience but was choosing not to show it. "You drew me from memory for 10 years. You kept sketchbooks. You followed my career from a distance, and when something good happened to you, you wondered what I was doing." Her voice shifted, not softer but more direct, the way a light got brighter when everything else dimmed. "And then I stood in your living room and told you that you were part of the equation, and you told me to go to New York." He looked at the floor, at the worn place in the wood near the kitchen doorway where Sophie had dragged a chair back and forth about 900 times over the past 2 years. "I didn't want to ask you to change your life," he said. "I didn't ask you to decide my life," she said. "I told you the situation. I wanted to know what you wanted. Those are different things." "I know." "What do you want, Caleb?" He looked up. She was watching him, and the thing in her face now was something he recognized because he'd seen it on Sophie when Sophie was waiting for him to say a true thing rather than a careful thing. The expression of someone who knew the difference and was not going to accept the substitution. "I want you to stay," he said. He said it quietly, without architecture around it. "I want you to stay, and I want to figure out what this is, and I am fully aware that I have done nothing in the past 30 seconds that should make you believe I can actually act on that rather than just say it." He exhaled. "I know how it sounds. I know what I just did. I said the wrong thing because the right thing scared me, and I don't have a way to make that okay. I can just tell you that I'm aware of it." Vivian was quiet for a moment. "The sketchbooks," she said. "Yeah. 10 years of sketchbooks. I wasn't—" He stopped. "I wasn't doing it on purpose. It just happened. You came up." "I came up," she repeated. "That's a significant understatement," he admitted. "I know." She stood there by the door with her coat over her arm, and Caleb could see her doing the things she did. The thorough assessment, the weighing, the deliberate decision about where to put the information in front of her. He had come to understand in the last week that this was not coldness. It was the opposite of coldness. It was what happened when someone cared enough about something to think about it carefully instead of just reacting. "I'm not making a company decision based on one weekend," she said finally. "I'm not asking you to. But I'm also not making it without acknowledging that this exists." She gestured briefly between them. "Whatever this is, okay. Which means I need you to be honest with me about what you can actually do here. Not what sounds supportive, not what sounds selfless, what you can actually do." She looked at him. "Can you do that?" "I can try." That's a provisional answer. It's the honest one. Something shifted slightly in her expression. The rigidity of it, not softened exactly, but unlocked, a single degree. She set her bag down on the chair by the door. Not on the floor. On the chair, which meant she was staying, but deliberately, not as surrender. "I'm hungry," she said. "I have pasta," he said, after a moment. "Then make pasta." He made pasta. It was not a sophisticated pasta. It was the weeknight version, the one he made when Sophie had been difficult about dinner and the negotiation had gone long and he needed something fast that she would actually eat. Garlic and olive oil and whatever cheese was in the refrigerator and a generous amount of black pepper. It was the most unglamorous thing he had cooked for another adult in years, and he made it without apologizing for it, which felt like its own kind of statement. They ate at the kitchen table again, and the conversation was quieter this time, stripped of some of the careful packaging from earlier. Vivian ate like she was hungry, not daintily, and she told him that the board call had been about the chairwoman offer, that they were moving the timeline up, that the decision they'd been treating as something she had months to consider had contracted to something she had weeks. "How do you feel about it?" he asked. "Professionally, it's exactly what I've been building toward." She wound pasta onto her fork. "Personally, I don't know. It's not as simple as it was 2 months ago." He nodded. "I keep thinking about the train station," she said. He looked at her. "What you said, about the engineer saying filling the cracks would be lying about what the building had been through." She set her fork down, not finished, but pausing. "I spent a long time filling cracks. Every time something didn't work out, I just rebuilt the wall higher and moved on. Didn't leave evidence." She looked at the table. "I think I'm tired of not leaving evidence." He understood this. He understood it in the specific way you understood something that matched the shape of your own experience without being identical to it. "Sophie's going to ask about you," he said. Vivian looked up. "She's going to come home tomorrow, and I'm going to look different, or act different, and she's going to ask who I spent the weekend with, because she notices everything, and she has no filter, and she will absolutely ask in the specific way 7-year-olds ask things, which is directly and without mercy." A pause. "What are you going to tell her?" Vivian said. "The truth, in the version appropriate for 7. He met her eyes. "That I spent the weekend with someone I've known for a long time, who I like very much and want to spend more time with." Vivian looked at him for a long moment. "That's a significant thing to say to a 7-year-old, she said. "Sophie doesn't respond well to vague. She has opinions about evasion." He paused. "She gets that from me, allegedly." "Allegedly," Vivian said, and something in her voice had shifted back toward the register it had been in the kitchen earlier, before the phone call, before New York entered the room. They finished dinner. He washed the dishes, which he did by hand because the dishwasher had been making a noise for 3 weeks that suggested it was working through something internal, and he hadn't addressed it yet. And Vivian dried, and this was so domestically ordinary that he didn't think about it until they were almost done, and he noticed she had located the dish towel without asking where it was, which meant she had been paying attention to his kitchen without announcing it. "Stay," he said. Not the way he'd said it earlier, not with the weight of the whole conversation on it, just plainly, about tonight. "It's late. Stay." She looked at him. "I have things to do tomorrow morning." "I know. I need to be up early." "I'm up early every day. I have a 7-year-old. She dried the last bowl, hung the dish towel on the handle of the oven. "Okay," she said. She stayed. What followed was not cinematic. He found her a spare toothbrush, still in the packaging, bought in bulk from the store near Sophie's school for the 3 or 4 times per year. Sophie had a friend sleep over. Vivian brushed her teeth in his bathroom, which had Sophie's plastic step stool still out beside the sink, and a collection of rubber bath toys along the tub ledge that he had been meaning to put away for 2 weeks. She looked at the bath toys with an expression that was trying not to be something and not entirely succeeding. "Gerald has a duplicate," Caleb said from the doorway, "in case of catastrophic Gerald loss. He lives behind the giraffe." Vivian looked at the orange rubber elephant behind the rubber giraffe. "Emergency protocol," she said. "Sophie's risk assessment is very thorough." He gave her a shirt to sleep in, an old gray one from a photography conference he'd attended 3 years ago. Too worn to be his first choice, but soft in the way that things got after enough washes. She took it without comment and changed, and Caleb lay on his side of the bed looking at the ceiling while she settled beside him, and the ordinariness of it, the actual undramatic normalness of another person in the space, was so unfamiliar that he was awake for a long time after she fell asleep. He listened to her breathe. He looked at the ceiling. He thought about what she'd said, "You leave first," and held it without pushing it away, because it was true. And he'd known it was true, and having it said directly was different from knowing it privately. Private knowledge was something you could keep manageable. Public knowledge, even between 2 people, had a different weight. He thought about his mother calling from the hospital, about the 2 weeks in which everything had reorganized around catastrophe, about being 17 and deciding, in the logic of grief and shock, that Vivian Sterling did not need to be handed his family's disaster. that the kindest thing was to be gone. He had been doing that ever since, in smaller ways. He had done it with Rachel, had retreated from the marriage before she finished retreating, so that when she left he could tell himself he had expected it, had been prepared. He had done it with friendships that asked more than he knew how to give. He had done it 45 minutes ago, standing at his own window, telling a woman who had come back to him across a decade that she should go to New York. The ceiling was unremarkable. He'd looked at it from this angle for 4 years. He fell asleep eventually. In the morning, she was up before him, sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop and a coffee she had made from his machine, with the competence of someone who had located the coffee and the filters by inspection rather than instruction. She was in the conference shirt, and her hair was not arranged, and she was reading something on her screen with the focused attention of someone for whom morning apparently arrived fully operational, and she looked, he thought, standing in the kitchen doorway in yesterday's clothes, like someone who could be in this space regularly without it being a compromise for either of them. He made coffee for himself and sat across from her. "I have a question," he said. Not looking up. "What does the company decision actually require? Logistically. If you take the chairwoman position and New York is the base, what does Chicago cost you professionally?" She looked up. "Why?" "Because last night I told you to make the decision that was right for the company without telling you what I wanted, and I'm trying to do this differently." He wrapped both hands around his mug. "So, what does it actually cost?" She studied him for a moment, then closed the laptop. "Less than it would have 2 years ago," she said. "The company runs on distributed infrastructure. I have people in Chicago already. The chairwoman role is strategic rather than operational, which means my physical presence in any one location is less critical than it was when I was running daily operations." She paused. "What the board wants is symbolic proximity. They want me in New York because the board is in New York, and they're more comfortable when I'm across the elevator bank rather than a flight away." "But you could run it from Chicago." "I could run it from most places, if I structured it correctly." She looked at him evenly. "What are you asking, Caleb?" He took a breath. "I'm asking whether New York is actually necessary or whether it's the path of least resistance," he said. "Because those are different problems, and I want to be honest with you about what I'm actually trying to say here, which is..." He stopped. "I'm not going to tell you to take New York, and I'm not going to tell you to move to Chicago. You should make the decision that's right for you, but I want you to make it knowing that I'm not..." Another stop. He found it. "I'm not planning to disappear again. Whatever you decide about the company, I want to be part of the conversation, an actual part of it. Not the version of me that tells you to go to New York because it sounds like the selfless thing to say." Vivian was quiet. Outside, the city was waking up in the slow Sunday way. Traffic building, but not urgent, distant sound of someone's radio. The particular quality of October morning light that came low and amber through the kitchen window. "You're telling me to fight for us," she said. "I'm telling you that I'm going to, so you should know that." She looked at him for a long moment. Not the assessing look, not the careful one. Something more unguarded than either. "Okay," she said. "Then here's what's actually true." She opened her laptop, turned it to face him. On the screen was a spreadsheet. She had apparently been working on this when he walked in. Flight schedules, city distances, travel times between Chicago and New York. Chicago to New York is 2 hours by air, 1 hour time difference, 6 viable flight options per day on the routes that matter. She turned the laptop back. "I've been running the numbers for 4 days. He stared at her. "You've been planning this." "I run a company. I don't enter situations without data." She closed the laptop again. "I was waiting to see what you actually wanted before I told you what I'd worked out." He sat back. "You were testing me," he said. "I was giving you the opportunity to show me who you were going to be in this," she said. "There's a difference." He thought about last night, about the window and the delivery truck and the couple with the dog and the wrong thing he'd said, about how long it had taken him to get to the right thing. "I almost failed," he said. "You course-corrected," she said. "That matters more than not making the mistake." He put his hands flat on the table, looked at them. "So what are we actually talking about?" he said. "If we do this, we are talking about being adults who live in different cities who are willing to be inconvenienced regularly," she said. "I come to Chicago, you come to New York. We build it from the middle because that's what's actually available right now." Sophie's in school. I know, she can't travel on school weeks. That limits the schedule, but it doesn't eliminate it. She said it practically, without resentment, as someone who had already thought this through. I'm not asking for a guarantee, I'm asking for a genuine attempt. For how long? Let's say 3 months. 12 weeks? Real commitment, no treating silence as a substitute for communication when something goes wrong. She met his eyes. If it's not working at 3 months, we say so honestly. If it is working, we reassess from a position of having actually tried. He looked at her. You've thought about this a lot, he said. I've thought about you a lot, she said simply, for longer than is rational. At this point, I'd like to find out if the rational version of it is any good. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. She looked at their hands. I'm falling in love with you, he said. He said it in the same register he'd used when he talked about Sophie at the train station. Not as declaration, not performing it, just as information he had arrived at and was passing along. I don't know when it started, probably before the reunion. I just wanted you to know that's the context for everything I've said in the last 12 hours, including the wrong thing. Vivian turned her hand under his so they were palm to palm. I know, she said. You know? The sketchbooks, Caleb. He laughed. Came out of him unexpected, the real kind. She kissed him across the table, which was logistically awkward given the laptops and the coffee mugs and the general furniture arrangement, and they managed it anyway, and it was not elegant in the slightest, and it was the best thing that had happened in his kitchen in recent memory. They agreed to the 3 months. They agreed on the schedule. Every 2 weeks, alternating who traveled. Real dates. Not video calls that drifted into working while talking, not texts that substituted for actual conversation, but planned, committed time. They agreed that when something was wrong, they would say it was wrong rather than going quiet and waiting for the other person to notice. This last one Caleb suggested himself, unprompted, which Vivian noted with a small nod that he understood was not a small thing. She left at noon for the airport. He drove her, and at the departure's drop-off, she leaned across the console and kissed him once, direct and brief. 2 weeks, she said. 2 weeks, he confirmed. I'll come to you. You're sure? I'll book the flight today. She got out, pulled her carry-on from the back seat, and walked toward the entrance without looking back. He sat at the curb until the automatic doors closed behind her. Then he drove to his mother's house to pick up Sophie. His mother opened the door before he reached the porch because she had always been able to hear his car from 2 houses away, a skill she had developed when he was a teenager and had never lost. She was 61 and still moved like a woman who had decided at some point that age was more of a concept than a constraint. And she looked at him on her porch with the expression of someone conducting a rapid assessment. You look different, she said. Good morning to you too. It's afternoon, you look different. She stepped aside to let him in. Different good or different bad? Different good, I think. She looked at him for another moment with the particular attention of a woman who had held her family together through her own medical crisis, and a move and a son who had spent the better part of a decade being competent at everything except his own happiness. Sophie's in the backyard with the hose, she said. She found a mud situation. Of course she did. Caleb. She put her hand on his arm before he went through. Does this different good have a name? He looked at his mother. Vivian Sterling, he said. His mother was quiet for exactly 1 second. I knew it, she said. I sent you that link and I knew it. You sent me that link very casually. I sent it very deliberately, she said, without remorse. Go get your daughter. Sophie was in the backyard with mud on her knees and Gerald in one hand and the hose in the other, engaged in an activity that seemed to involve a small trench she was excavating near the garden border. When she saw Caleb, she held up Gerald, who had acquired mud on one ear. Gerald found treasure, she announced. What kind of treasure? We don't know yet. That's why we're digging. He crouched down beside her, not worrying about his jeans, and looked at the trench. It was about 8 inches long and 3 inches deep and contained what appeared to be a rock and a piece of an old terracotta pot. Good progress, he said. Sophie studied him with the directness she applied to most things. You're different. So everyone keeps telling me. Different like you don't have the worry line. She pointed between his eyebrows. You always have the worry line on Sunday. He looked at his daughter, who was 7, and caked in mud and holding a stuffed elephant, and had apparently been tracking his facial tension patterns. "I had a nice weekend," he said. "Did you make a friend?" "I think so, yeah." Sophie considered this, transferred Gerald to her other hand, and went back to digging with the focused efficiency of someone who had allocated time to this project and wasn't going to let social conversation eat into it. "Okay," she said. "Can we have waffles tonight?" "We can have waffles tonight." "With the blueberries or without?" "Which do you want?" "Both," she said. "The blueberries on the side so they don't get soggy but available." "That's a reasonable position," he said. "Let's go home." The months that followed did not proceed smoothly because nothing real proceeded smoothly, and Caleb and Vivian had made an implicit agreement somewhere in the early weeks to stop pretending smoothness was the goal. The first visit went well. He flew to New York on a Thursday, and she gave him the city in the way someone gave you a place they'd built a life in, the specific route she walked on mornings that ran long, the coffee place that had terrible service and extraordinary espresso, the corner in Central Park where the light hit a certain way at 4 in the afternoon in fall that she'd been meaning to photograph for 2 years and hadn't. He photographed it. She didn't ask him to, but she watched him do it and didn't say anything, and afterward when he showed her the frame, she looked at it for a long time without speaking, and he understood that he'd gotten the thing he'd been trying to get in the train station drawings. The feeling, rather than the structure. "Send me that," she said. "It's yours," he said. The second visit, she came to Chicago and met Sophie. This was not a planned introduction. It happened the way things happened when a 7-year-old was part of the equation, which was that Sophie arrived home from school on Thursday while Vivian was still at the apartment because a parent pickup mix-up had moved the schedule by 40 minutes, and Caleb heard the door and came into the entryway to find Sophie standing with her backpack still on, looking at Vivian with the direct, unself-conscious stare of someone who had not yet learned to pretend she wasn't looking. "Hi," Sophie said. "Hi," Vivian said. "Are you the friend?" A beat. "I am," Vivian said. Sophie looked at her for another moment, set down her backpack, which she was not supposed to drop in the entryway, went into the kitchen, came back with a single cracker, held it out toward Vivian. "We have snack after school," she said. Vivian took the cracker. "Thank you," she said. Sophie nodded, as if an important assessment had been completed to her satisfaction, and went to wash her hands in the bathroom, which she never did without being reminded. And Caleb stood in the entryway understanding that his daughter had just extended the specific version of hospitality available to her, and that this meant something he did not yet have full language for. The weeks had difficulty in them. There were nights Vivian called late and exhausted, and the conversation went flat because she was running on 4 hours and he was still calibrating the time difference, and they figured out that late calls on work nights were not the same as real conversation, and started scheduling actual check-ins rather than trying to catch each other in the margins. There was a canceled flight in November. Caleb's, a winter storm. The substitute flight that was supposed to land at noon didn't land until 9:30 at night, and they spent an hour of that in a sharp, stupid argument about nothing that was actually about the exhaustion of distance that neither of them had wanted to say directly. He called back after they hung up. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm just tired, and I wanted to be there hours ago." "I know," she said. "I'm sorry too. I took it out on you." "Yeah. I do that when I'm anxious. I find something external to criticize." "I do the opposite. I go quiet." "I noticed." "We're a fun combination," he said. "We are genuinely not easy," she agreed. There was a long pause, and then she said, "But I'm not interested in easy. I'm interested in this." He sat in the airport gate at 9:45 at night, delayed flight board updating around him, people in various states of resigned waiting. "Me too," he said. He was not a man who said things he didn't mean anymore. He was 32 and a single father, and he had learned, expensively, over time, that saying true things was less costly in the long run than saying convenient ones. The flight landed. He got there. They ordered food at midnight from a place she knew, ate it on her couch while she told him about the board meeting that week, and he told her about Sophie's school project on bridges, which Sophie had extended into a personal investigation of every bridge in Chicago based on a map she'd made and was updating daily. "She's going to be an engineer," Vivian said. She's going to be whatever she decides, he said. I've stopped guessing. She changes direction approximately every 3 weeks. Current direction? Bridges. Before that, marine biology. Before that, a brief but intense interest in becoming a judge. Vivian smiled. The real one, not the press release one. I like her, she said. She likes you too. How do you know? She shared her snack. He looked at her. Sophie does not share snacks with people she's ambivalent about. It's a reliable metric. Outside Vivian's apartment, New York was doing what it did at midnight. Continuous, never entirely dark, the sound of the city a constant low register under everything. Caleb looked at the window and thought about his own city sleeping, Sophie at his mother's, the Gerald backup unit behind the rubber giraffe, the train station with its coffered ceiling and its honest cracks. He thought about the sketchbooks. He thought about being 17 and deciding the kindest thing was silence. And sitting on a couch in New York with Vivian's shoulder against his, and the city outside and the 12 weeks behind them, and whatever came next still unresolved and fully open, he was not afraid of it in the way he had been afraid of things for a long time. He was not gone. He was not preemptively leaving. He was right here, present in a way that cost something real. And the cost was fine. The cost was worth it. The cost was what it meant to stay. The call came on a Tuesday morning in January, 3 months and 11 days after the reunion, which meant they had technically exceeded their agreed trial period by 11 days without either of them remarking on it. Caleb was in his car outside Sophie's school, having just completed drop-off, sitting in the line of parents doing the slow crawl toward the exit, when his phone buzzed with the notification from his firm. He read it twice. Then he pulled into a parking space on the street and read it a third time. The Delancey Hall Project, a full restoration commission for a 1928 Art Deco broadcast hall on the west side of Manhattan that his firm had been pursuing for 14 months, had been awarded. Not to the senior partner who had shepherded the bid, but with Caleb listed as lead documentation photographer and on-site architectural consultant for the duration of the restoration. A role that was unusual for someone with his title and that the senior partner had apparently argued for specifically and at some length. The project was 18 months minimum, possibly 24. The firm expected him to be in New York for most of it. He sat in the parking space for about 4 minutes doing nothing. Then he called Vivian. She picked up on the second ring, which meant she was between meetings rather than in one. Hey, everything okay? I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen before you say anything. A pause. That's not a relaxing opening. My firm got the Delancey Hall commission. I'm the lead on it. It's in New York. 18 months, probably more. Silence. Vivian? I'm listening, she said. You said listen first. I'm not telling you this because I need you to do anything with it. I'm telling you because 3 months ago I sat at your kitchen table and we agreed that honesty was the operating principle, and this is me being honest. He looked through the windshield at the street. This is a legitimate opportunity. The hall is extraordinary. It's been sitting derelict for 11 years, and the work to document this restoration is the kind of project that comes around once in a career. I'm not manufacturing a reason to be in your city, but I'm also not pretending the timing is a coincidence in terms of what it means. Another silence, longer. When does it start? She said. They want me there by March 1st. More silence. He could hear her breathing, could hear the faint sound of her office, the ambient noise of a functioning empire, phones and keyboards, and the low register hum of people working. Caleb, she said finally. Yeah. I'm going to need approximately 10 minutes to not say something that gives too much away about how I feel about this. He almost laughed. Take your time. Can I call you back? I'll be here. She called back in 7 minutes, which meant she had lasted 7 of the 10. When she called, her voice was different. Not the careful boardroom register, but the other one. The one that existed only in the kitchen in the morning or late at night when the performance was too much work. Tell me about the hall, she said. He told her about Delancey Hall. He had been following it for years, had photographed the exterior twice on personal trips to New York, had a folder on his laptop of reference images, and historical documentation going back to its construction. The main broadcast chamber had a ceiling that was original plasterwork. intricate geometric patterns in cream and gold leaf, about 30% of which had been lost to water damage and neglect over the decades. The restoration team planned to reconstruct the lost sections using period-accurate methods, which meant the documentation work was not just photographic but archival, building a visual record thorough enough to guide craftspeople recreating something that no longer fully existed. "You're going to rebuild it from memory," Vivian said. "Essentially. Like the sketchbooks." He sat with that for a moment. "Yeah," he said, "like the sketchbooks." She was quiet for a beat, and then she said, "I have 400 square feet of spare room in my apartment that has been a very expensive storage space for 18 months. I want to say that with no pressure attached, it's information. You can do with it what you want. 400 square feet. The East Room, good light in the morning. I was going to make it a proper office, but I kept not doing it." He looked at the school entrance where a teacher was holding the door while the last few late arrivals filed in. "I need to find a school for Sophie," he said, "in New York. I need to figure out the logistics, the enrollment, whether she can transfer mid-year or whether we wait until fall. The Callaway School on the Upper West Side has a strong second-grade program. I looked it up in October." He went still. "October," he said, after the second visit, when Sophie showed me the bridge map. A pause. "I wasn't planning anything. I looked it up. I like to have information." "You looked up New York schools for my daughter in October." "I looked up schools in our neighborhood in October," she said, and then stopped, and he understood she had said our neighborhood without intending to and had heard herself do it. "Vivian," he said, "I know. Our neighborhood." I said, "I know." He pressed his fingers against his mouth for a moment, not laughing, just absorbing. "I'll call the school," he said. Sophie took the news with the equanimity of someone for whom Gerald the elephant constituted adequate emotional infrastructure for most situations. Caleb told her on a Wednesday evening at the kitchen table, the same table where they had negotiated shoes and waffles and the terms of countless small domestic treaties, and he told her plainly because Sophie was not a child who responded well to anything else. New York, new school, new apartment, Vivian's building. Sophie listened with her hands flat on the table and her expression working through several phases, none of which Caleb could fully decode in real time. "Is Vivian going to be there?" she said. "Yes, we'd be in her building. You'd see her a lot." Sophie thought about this. "Does she know about the bridge project?" "You could tell her about it yourself?" "I'm on Bridge 14, Sophie said, as if this established something important. "I'll let her know." Sophie picked up her fork and went back to her dinner. Caleb watched her, waiting. "Okay," Sophie said. "Okay? Can Gerald come?" "Gerald goes everywhere. That's the whole point of Gerald." "Okay," she said again, and that was the decision. His mother cried, which he had expected. She cried and then made him coffee and told him he was doing the right thing, which she would not have said if she didn't mean it, because his mother had been constitutionally incapable of comforting dishonesty since the hospital, since the recovery, since the years that had reshaped her into someone who had decided that life was too short for the polite version of things. She asked him if he was sure, and he said he was, and she asked him if Vivian was sure, and he said she was. And his mother said, "Good. Then stop standing in my kitchen and go pack." He packed. Not everything. The apartment he sublet furnished to a graduate student who was delighted by the availability and unfazed by the rubber bath toys, which Caleb moved to a box in the closet. He brought the sketchbooks, all of them, the current one and the ones going back to high school, the ones with the drawings of Vivian in them, and the buildings and the record of his eye moving through a decade of spaces. He brought Sophie's artwork from the refrigerator, carefully removed with no tearing. He brought the photographs he'd printed and framed, not the professional work, the personal ones. Sophie at the lake with Gerald, his mother at Thanksgiving, a shot of the Harrington terminal ceiling that he'd taken 3 years ago on his phone, not professionally, just for himself. He brought what mattered. The rest was furniture. They moved to New York on a Saturday in late February, which meant the city was cold and the moving truck had to navigate streets that were not designed with moving trucks in mind, which meant what should have taken 2 hours took 4.5, and ended with a situation involving a loading dock reservation that had been given to another tenant, and required 30 minutes of negotiation that Vivian handled with the calm efficiency of someone who ran a company and was therefore entirely unintimidated by logistics that would have unraveled most people. Sophie watched this from the sidewalk with Gerald under her arm. "Vivian's good at problems," she observed to Caleb. "She is. Like you're good at pictures." "Something like that." "That's a good combination," Sophie said, with the authority of someone who had considered it. "Different good things." He looked at his daughter on a New York sidewalk in February with her elephant, stating the nature of functional relationships with the casual accuracy that she applied to most things. "Yeah," he said, "it is." The East Room was repainted. Vivian had done this before they arrived, had not told Caleb, had just had it done, a warm off-white that caught the morning light the way she'd described, and had put nothing in it except a second-hand drafting table she'd sourced from an architectural salvage place in Brooklyn because she'd looked up what kind of drafting table Caleb used and found something close. He stood in the doorway of the East Room the first morning. The light came in the way she'd said it would. He set his sketchbooks on the drafting table and did not say anything for a moment. "Is it okay?" she said from behind him. "It's more than okay. I wasn't sure about the table. I wasn't sure if the height was right." "The height is right. I can exchange it if—" "Vivian." He turned around. "The height is right." She looked at him with the expression he had come to know as her version of relief. Not displayed, just present, a slight loosening around the eyes. "Good," she said. Delancey Hall was everything he had anticipated and considerably more difficult. The first time he walked the main broadcast chamber with the lead restoration architect, a compact and exacting woman named Dr. Patricia Osei, who had devoted the better part of her career to structures that other people had given up on, he stood under the partial ceiling and looked up at the geometric patterns. Cream and faded gold, interrupted by the water-stained gaps where the plasterwork had given way, and felt the same thing he had felt at the Calumet steel mill at 25, in the Harrington terminal at 30. The feeling he did not have a word for, the thing that lived between sadness and beauty. Dr. Osei stood beside him looking up. "We can get about 60% of the original documentation from the city archives," she said. "Photographs, blueprints, the original artisan specs. The rest we're reconstructing from what's here and from comparative analysis of period-adjacent work." "What's the hardest part to reconstruct?" She pointed to the northeast section, where a large geometric medallion was almost entirely gone. "That. The central medallion design was specific to this hall. It doesn't appear in the firm's other work from the period. We have 2 partial photographs from 1934 that show maybe 40% of it." She looked at him. "Your job is to help us see what we can't see. You document what exists, and you help us build the visual argument for what we believe existed." He looked at the gap where the medallion had been. He thought about the Harrington terminal, the repaired northeast corner, the thing he had never quite managed to draw. He thought about what Vivian had said standing at his drafting table. "You're trying to draw what you feel when you look at it, not the ceiling itself." And he thought about 10 years of sketchbooks and the specific practice of building a record of something from incomplete evidence. "I can do that," he said. The work began. It consumed him in the way that real work consumed him. Not unpleasantly, not at the expense of everything else, but thoroughly. The way a project that mattered occupied the parts of his mind that needed occupying. He was at the hall most mornings by 7, documenting, conferring with Dr. Osei's team, developing the visual argument for what the missing sections had looked like. He picked Sophie up from the Callaway School on the days he wasn't held late, and on the days he was, Vivian picked her up, a development that had evolved gradually and without formal discussion until it was simply part of the schedule. Sophie told Vivian about Bridge 14 on the second pickup. Vivian listened to the full explanation, which took approximately 12 minutes, and then asked several specific questions about the structural principles involved, which Sophie answered with the authority of someone who had done extensive self-directed research. By the following week, Sophie had informed Caleb that Vivian understood bridges better than most people. "High praise," Caleb said. "She asked the right questions," Sophie said, which was Sophie's most consistent metric for the value of another person's engagement. The months moved the way months did when you were inside a life rather than waiting at the edge of one, faster than expected, and with a texture that made them feel full rather than long. Spring came to New York in its particular way, sudden and then overwhelming. The trees along the street outside Vivian's building going from bare to full green in what felt like a week. Sophie found a friend at the Callaway School, a girl named Priya, whose family lived 4 blocks away and who shared Sophie's interest in both structural engineering and the question of whether animals had opinions about architecture, which Sophie had been developing as a theory since March. Caleb's mother visited in April. She came for 5 days and stayed in a hotel 2 blocks away because she said she valued her independence and also because she wanted to be able to form her impressions of the situation without feeling like a house guest. On the second evening, she and Vivian sat at the kitchen table for 3 hours after dinner while Caleb put Sophie to bed, and he came back to find them still there, the wine mostly gone, his mother laughing at something Vivian had said with the specific laugh she reserved for things she found genuinely funny rather than politely funny. He stood in the kitchen doorway. His mother looked up and saw him, and her expression did the thing it did when she was moved and was not going to advertise it. "Go to bed," she said. "We're talking." He went to bed. There were hard parts. There were always hard parts, and the particular hard parts of their situation were the ones that came from proximity after distance. The adjustment of 2 people who had built efficient solitary habits learning to share space without either of them losing the self that the solitude had shaped. Vivian's work still ran long. She still sometimes came home at 9:30 with the particular energy of someone who had been at full operational capacity for 14 hours and needed 20 minutes of silence before she could be available to anything domestic. And Caleb had learned, not immediately, but over months, that this was not distance, not withdrawal, just recovery, and that the 20 minutes was a door that opened rather than closed. He still went quiet when things were hard. This was the pattern she'd named on the night she almost left, and it did not disappear because she'd named it. It just became visible, which meant he caught it sooner. She had learned to say, plainly, "You've gone quiet. Is something wrong?" And he had learned to answer honestly rather than say nothing's wrong when something clearly was. This sounds simple. It was not simple. It was a practice, the way the restoration work was a practice. Daily, incremental, requiring the willingness to show up and do it even when the progress was not dramatic. Sophie, for her part, moved through all of it with the adaptive resourcefulness of a child who had grown up understanding that her family was shaped differently from other families, and that this was not a deficit. She had always known how to build home from available materials, and the available materials here were good. They were, she explained to Priya one afternoon while they were working on a joint bridge project at the kitchen table. Different from a regular family, but not worse. Just a different structure, like a suspension bridge versus a beam bridge. Same purpose, different engineering. Priya accepted this explanation. Caleb, overhearing from the next room, did not say anything for a long moment. Then he went back to the drafting table and picked up his pencil and drew his daughter's hands on the table, quick and not precise, the way you drew something you didn't want to lose track of. The Delancey Hall ceiling took 14 months. The Northeast medallion, the missing one, the one that existed only in 2 partial photographs from 1934, took 4 of those months by itself. Dr. Osei's team built the visual argument from the fragments, from the comparative analysis, from Caleb's documentation work, and from several sessions where the team spread the partial photographs on a light table and looked at them until the logic of the pattern became clear, the way you looked at an incomplete word until the missing letters resolved. When the restorers completed the medallion, working in the period-accurate method, plaster-on-wire armature, gold leaf applied by hand, Caleb stood under it with his camera and looked up. It was not the original. Everyone involved understood this. The original was gone, irretrievably gone, existed now only in the partial photographs and in the memory of a building that had held it for 60 years before the water came through. What was up there was a careful, honest reconstruction, built from evidence and expertise and the willingness to commit to what the evidence suggested, rather than leaving the gap, because completion felt presumptuous. Dr. Osei stood beside him. "Does it look right?" she said. He looked up at the medallion for a long time. "It looks like what it was," he said, "and it looks like what we made it, both things at once." She nodded slowly. "That's the best we can do." I think that's enough, he said. 1 year and 3 weeks after the night they danced in the school corridor, Caleb asked Vivian to marry him. He did not do it in a restaurant. He did not arrange anything elaborate. He had thought about elaborate, had considered several versions of it, had dismissed them one by one as not right, as too much performance around something that should be simple. He did it on a Sunday morning in the East Room, which had become a shared space over the months. Her files on one shelf, his sketchbooks on another, the drafting table, and beside it a small desk she used when she worked from home, which happened more than it used to because she had found, gradually, that she was better at certain kinds of thinking when she was near him. They were both working. He was at the drafting table, she was at the small desk with her laptop. Sophie was at the Callaway School for a weekend science program she had enrolled in specifically because it involved constructing a model of the Brooklyn Bridge. He had been carrying the ring for 3 weeks, in the inside pocket of the sport coat, because he'd bought it and then couldn't locate the right moment, and had eventually understood that he was waiting for the right moment the way he waited for the right frame. You couldn't force it, but you could stay present until it arrived. He got up from the drafting table. Vivian did not look up from her laptop. I need to tell you something, he said. Still not looking up. Good something or good something. She looked up. He was standing next to her desk with the ring box in his hand, which he had not opened yet. He was wearing an old shirt, and his hair was the way it was on Sunday mornings, and he had not planned a speech because he did not have a speech. He had the truth, which he had discovered over the past year, was the only thing that worked between them anyway. I spent a long time, he said, being very good at leaving before things could leave me. You said that. It was accurate. He turned the ring box over once in his hand. I'm not going to tell you I'm done being scared of things. I don't think that's how it works. But I can tell you that whatever I'm scared of, I would rather be scared of it next to you than not scared of it alone. Vivian had set down her laptop. She was looking at him with that expression, the one that was not the boardroom expression, not the careful one, not the one she wore when she was assessing information, the one that was just her, undressed of everything professional, looking at him like he was the specific answer to a question she had been asking for a very long time. Open the box, she said. He opened the box. She looked at the ring. Simple, not ostentatious, a single stone set low, the kind of thing she would actually wear. And then she looked at him. I want Sophie to know I asked you, he said. I want her to know that her dad chose this, chose you, not as a practical arrangement, but because... He stopped. Found it. Because you're the person who asked about the tile work above the bakery door because you researched schools in October, because you sat on my kitchen counter and ate cheese off the cutting board without asking, because you looked at my drawings and told me what I was actually trying to do. Vivian stood up from the chair. Yes, she said. I didn't ask yet. You asked, she said. You've been asking since Indiana. She took the ring from the box herself, which was very Vivian, and put it on her own finger, which was also very Vivian, and looked at it for a moment. How's the height? He said. She looked up with the real smile, the small one. The height is right, she said. He kissed her in the East Room in the Sunday morning light, and it was not elegant because the desk was in the way, and he knocked a folder off it, and neither of them cared. They told Sophie that afternoon when she came home from the bridge program. She came in still carrying the model Brooklyn Bridge, which was surprisingly large and had been constructed with a level of structural accuracy that her teacher had apparently found startling in a second grader. She set it carefully on the kitchen table and looked at them, and read the room the way she read most things, directly, without fuss. Did something happen? She said. We have something to tell you, Caleb said. Sophie looked at Vivian's hand. Is that a new ring? She said. Yes, Vivian said. Did Dad give it to you? I put it on myself, but yes. Sophie looked at the ring, looked at Caleb, looked at Vivian. The look was thorough and unself-conscious, and 8 months of knowing this person were somewhere in it. Are you going to be my family? She said to Vivian. Not the question a child asked to be assured. The question a child asked when they already knew the answer and wanted the adult to say it out loud. Yes, Vivian said, if that's okay with you. Sophie thought about it for a moment. Then she picked up Gerald from her bag and held him out toward Vivian with the gravity of someone transferring something of real value. "Gerald approves of you," she said. He didn't approve of Mrs. DeLuca from school, and he was right about that. His instincts are good. Vivian took Gerald carefully, looked at him, handed him back. "I'm glad he approves," she said. "We got married," Sophie announced to the kitchen, or to Gerald, or to the Brooklyn Bridge model, or to all three. "We're getting married," Caleb said. "It takes some planning first." "How long?" "Some months." "How many months?" "We'll figure it out." Sophie accepted this timeline and went to examine her bridge model for structural integrity. They married in October, which meant Chicago was at the specific angle of autumn light that Caleb had spent 4 years trying to photograph correctly. The ceremony was at the Harrington Terminal, the train station, the one with the coffered ceiling and the cracked marble in the northeast corner that had been repaired in 1987 in a slightly different shade. He had asked, and the station had a space available for events on Saturday mornings before the afternoon commuter traffic. And it had occurred to him that the right place for this particular ceremony was the place he went when he needed proof that damaged things could be rebuilt without pretending the damage hadn't happened. There were 40 people, his mother in the front row, crying before anyone said a word, and not apologizing for it. Dr. Osei, who had become something adjacent to a friend over 14 months of shared work, and who brought her wife and sat in the third row and looked at the ceiling with the professional appreciation of someone who understood what had gone into the Harrington Terminal's restoration. Marcus, Caleb's cousin, who had guilted him into the reunion and who had accepted credit for the entire relationship with a magnanimity that was irritating and not entirely unjustified. Vivian came in without ceremony, without a long walk, without performance. She came from the side entrance with her mother beside her, and she was wearing something the color of winter light. And she was looking for Caleb before she reached the front, found him, and the expression that settled on her face when she found him was not bridal softness, was not the performed emotion of an occasion. It was relief. It was the specific relief of someone who had spent a long time wondering and had finally, definitively, stopped wondering. Sophie stood beside Caleb holding a small pillow with the rings on it, wearing a dress she had selected herself, which was the color of Gerald. She had insisted on this, and the argument had been brief because she had logic on her side. Gerald was part of the family and should be represented. When Vivian reached them, Sophie looked up at her with the direct, clear eyes that had looked at the world without flinching since she first started looking at it. "You look nice," Sophie told her. "You look excellent," Vivian said. "I know," Sophie said. "Gerald matches my dress." The ceremony was short because they had both read enough of each other to know that the weight of a thing did not require length to establish itself. The officiant, a friend of Vivian's from Northwestern, who had become a judge, which Sophie found professionally relevant, kept it simple. The vows were theirs, written separately and not shared in advance because they were both people who worked better without the safety net of prior approval. Caleb went first. He looked at Vivian and said, "I've been taking pictures of honest buildings my whole career, the ones that show their repairs, the ones where you can see what was lost and what was put back and what the difference is. I spent a long time not understanding that I was practicing for something." A pause. "I understand it now. Everything I know about staying, I've been learning for 10 years, mostly from you without knowing it. I'm going to keep learning it, with you, for however long you'll have me." Vivian looked at him for a moment without speaking. Then, "I am not a person who is easy to be close to. I've known this about myself for a long time. I make decisions before I explain them. I go quiet when I'm scared. I looked up schools for Sophie in October and didn't tell you because I didn't want you to know how much I'd already decided." She paused. "You found out anyway. You find out most things, eventually. I think I've been waiting my whole adult life for someone who bothered to look." Another pause. "I'm done waiting. I'm here." Sophie, at this point, shifted the ring pillow slightly and said in a stage whisper to Caleb, "This is the good part." He laughed. The room laughed. Vivian put her hand over her mouth, not to hide the smile, but just as somewhere to put the feeling. "Yeah," he said to Sophie, "this is the good part." The rings were exchanged. The judge said what judges say. They were married under the coffered ceiling of the Harrington Terminal, with the morning light coming through the clear story windows and landing on the marble floor in the way Caleb had spent years trying to capture. And finally, standing in the middle of it, rather than looking at it from the outside, he understood why he had never gotten the frame right. You could not photograph what it felt like to be inside the thing you had been trying to document from a distance. You had to be in it. That was the lesson. It was so simple that he could not believe how long it had taken him, and so difficult to actually do that, he understood completely why it had. In the years that followed, the Mercer-Sterling household was not a quiet one. Sophie grew into a person of formidable intelligence and strong opinions who went through phases the way other people went through seasons. A period of intensive interest in material science, a period of writing what she called novels, but were actually very long stories with chapters. A period of competitive debate that her school's team found both valuable and exhausting. She remained certain that Gerald had good instincts and consulted him, with diminishing irony as she got older, on matters of importance. Vivian built the creative headquarters in Chicago, which she had decided during the months that Caleb had been at Delancey Hall, quietly and without announcement, understanding that the question of where to build a company's heart was less complicated than her board believed when you were clear about where your own heart had decided to be. The chairwoman position in New York she negotiated to a structure that required her physical presence 4 days per month rather than full-time, an arrangement the board resisted and eventually accepted because she was Vivian Sterling and her results had never required their approval to materialize. She traveled. She worked long hours. She came home. Caleb returned to Chicago after Delancey Hall and went back to what he did, shooting honest buildings, documenting spaces that had survived things they weren't supposed to survive. He and Dr. Osei collaborated on 2 more projects in subsequent years, one in Philadelphia and one in Detroit, work that was slower and more personal than the commercial assignments, and that produced the photographs he was proudest of. He kept the sketchbooks. He kept drawing from memory. One of the drawings that appeared most often in the later books was not a building. It was Sophie at the kitchen table. It was Vivian at the East Room desk, not looking up. It was the 3 of them at the Harrington terminal on a Saturday morning, before the afternoon commuters came, when the light was at the angle where you could see everything clearly and still find it beautiful. He never fully captured it. He kept trying. There is a photograph that hangs in the hallway of their Chicago apartment, which they kept after the New York years because Chicago was where they had started, and starting places matter. Caleb took it on a timer on the morning of the wedding, not the professional shots, not the posed ones, but one he set up himself in the station before the guests arrived. It shows the 3 of them in the main hall of the Harrington terminal, Caleb in his good suit, Vivian in winter light, Sophie between them in the color of Gerald, all 3 looking up at the ceiling at the same moment, caught by something none of them remembered noticing. You can see the repaired section in the northeast corner, the slightly different shade, the honest record of what was lost and what was put back. You can see the cracks in the marble floor, original stress fractures, still stable, not filled. And you can see, if you look at the 3 of them rather than the building, at the angle of their heads, at the way Sophie has her hand tucked into Caleb's and her other hand reaching toward Vivian, that this is not a family that fell into place. This is a family that was assembled carefully, over time, from available materials, by people who had each spent long enough alone to understand the difference between need and choice. They chose. That is the whole of it, and it is enough, not the absence of damage, not the erasure of the years that were hard and lonely and full of the particular silence of people who had not yet found their way to each other, but the willingness, finally, to stop treating the distance as protection, to let the record show the repairs, to build something in the space where something had been lost, and call it honestly what it was. Not the original, not the perfect version, not the thing that would have existed if no time had been wasted. Something better than that. Something real.